December 1944. The Ardennes Forest lay buried under a cruel winter silence. Snow fell thick over shattered pines, muffling the growl of engines and the cries of wounded men. In a German command post near St. Vith, the air was heavy with cigarette smoke and confidence. Maps covered the tables, red arrows thrusting deep into American lines. The plan seemed flawless. Across the front, American units were scattered and disoriented. Radio lines went dead. Convoys burned in the snow. What German intelligence saw looked like a full-scale collapse. To many Wehrmacht generals, it felt as if victory, real, decisive victory, had finally returned to their grasp. But beneath that apparent chaos, something else was forming. In the frozen woods, U.S. engineers mined the roads they had just retreated from. Artillerymen quietly repositioned their guns. And in a farmhouse near Bastogne, American officers gathered around a single oil lamp, plotting the counterstroke that would turn a defeat into one of the most brilliant traps of the war. The trap was already closing. By the winter of 1944, Nazi Germany was a cornered power. The Eastern Front was collapsing under the weight of the Red Army, and in the West, Allied forces had torn through France after D-Day. Paris was free, and Hitler's empire was shrinking by the week. Yet, in those final desperate months, the German High Command believed it still had one last move, a strike so bold it could fracture the Allied coalition and perhaps force a negotiated peace. That plan would become known as the Ardennes Offensive, or as history remembers it, the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's idea was simple but daring. He wanted to drive a massive wedge through the thinly held American lines in Belgium and Luxembourg, then race west toward Antwerp. Capturing that vital port would split the British and American armies, isolate their supplies, and throw the Western Front into chaos. To lead it, Hitler turned to trusted veterans, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, General Otto von Manchoffel, and Sepp Dietrich, the fanatical SS commander. They gathered nearly 200,000 men, 1,000 tanks, and 2,000 artillery pieces, a last reservoir of German strength. Many of these troops were pulled from the Eastern Front or hastily formed from training schools and Luftwaffe ground crews. The plan depended on speed, weather, and surprise. And at first, it worked. On December 16, 1944, before dawn, the stillness of the Ardennes exploded under a thunderous German artillery barrage. Villages vanished under fire. American positions were swallowed in fog and confusion. In the first 24 hours, entire units were overrun. Among them the inexperienced 106th Infantry Division, which lost more than 8,000 men almost immediately. German tanks rolled through the snow-covered roads, their engines echoing off the frozen hills. The Panzer-Lehr Division, once shattered in Normandy, was reborn and charging forward again. Kampfgruppe Paper, led by SS officer Joachim Paper, tore through American convoys, leaving behind burning wreckage and massacres that would later define its name in infamy. Every sign pointed to a breakthrough. The American lines bent and fractured. Refugees clogged the roads. The Allies had been caught completely off guard. Even General Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, admitted the attack was a surprise. In Berlin, Hitler's staff celebrated the first major German advance in months. For a brief moment, radio reports carried the illusion of momentum. Propaganda ministers boasted that the Reich was rising again. German officers studying the maps saw the front bulging outward, a literal bulge in the Allied line, and believed this was the beginning of a reversal of fortune. But beneath the surface, cracks were already forming. The Germans had gambled everything on timing and secrecy. They lacked fuel, air support, and reserves. Their attack depended on capturing Allied fuel depots along the way. Every lost hour meant tanks stranded in the snow. And the deeper they pushed into the Ardennes, the more exposed their flanks became. Meanwhile, on the American side, chaos was slowly giving way to order. Units that had been scattered began to regroup. Field commanders such as General Troy Middleton and General Omar Bradley quickly stabilized defensive lines. Eisenhower's headquarters in Versailles went from disbelief to calm determination. Reinforcements were rushed from France. In those first few days, the American army seemed broken, but it wasn't. Its soldiers were bloodied, cold, and outnumbered, yet they refused to collapse completely. Small groups fought delaying actions, buying precious hours for reinforcements. Roadblocks appeared in the snow. Engineers blew up bridges to choke German armor. What the Germans mistook for retreat was often a deliberate, measured withdrawal. By December 18, the so-called collapse was already beginning to take shape as something else, a baited front that would draw German armor into a narrow corridor surrounded by high ground and fortified towns. The Americans were setting their own silent trap, even as German officers still believed they were chasing a fleeing enemy. And at the heart of that developing storm lay one small town, Bastogne. Bastogne was a quiet market town in southern Belgium, surrounded by dense forest and 7 key roads. To the German command, it was a crossroads that had to be seized quickly to open the route west toward the Meuse River and Antwerp. To the Americans, it became a symbol of resistance. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the heart of the Ardennes. By December 19, 1944, the situation looked desperate. The German 5th and 6th Panzer armies had pierced deep into the Allied front. Towns like Saint-Vith and Clairvaux were under siege. Communications were in chaos. To many observers, it looked as if the entire American First Army was crumbling. Yet within this chaos, a remarkable display of improvisation began. General Troy Middleton, commander of 8 Corps, made a critical decision. Bastogne must be held at all costs. He assigned the 101st Airborne Division, under Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, and elements of the 10th Armored Division to defend the town. Trucks and half-tracks rushed through blizzards to reach their positions. Many paratroopers arrived without winter gear or heavy weapons, but morale was steady. They were veterans of Normandy and Holland, men used to impossible odds. At the same time, General Dwight D. Eisenhower faced his own crisis at headquarters. Reports from the front were fragmented, maps were useless. It was one of the few times in the war that the Allies had completely lost the initiative. Eisenhower gathered his top field commanders, Bradley, Patton, Montgomery, and ordered immediate coordination. There would be no retreat from Belgium. The German offensive, he declared, would be contained, then crushed. This was when General George S. Patton entered the story with his characteristic speed and clarity. His Third Army, positioned in Luxembourg to the south, was already engaged in heavy fighting. Yet within hours of hearing the first reports, Patton began planning a 90-degree pivot of his entire army to move north toward Bastogne, an enormous logistical maneuver in freezing weather. It would take thousands of trucks, artillery pieces, and fuel convoys moving across icy roads, but Patton was determined. While the Americans scrambled, the Germans pushed harder. Von Manschuffel's panzer divisions encircled Bastogne by December 21. Artillery thundered day and night. Paratroopers dug foxholes in the frozen ground, using helmets to shovel ice. Food and ammunition ran low. Yet every attempt to break through the American line was repelled. Inside the surrounded town, General McAuliffe received a written demand for surrender from the German commander. His one-word reply would become legend: nuts. The word spread across the front lines, lifting morale. To the Germans, it was arrogance. To the Americans, defiance. Meanwhile, the weather, which had been one of Germany's biggest allies, began to shift. The thick fog that had grounded Allied aircraft for days started to lift. On December 23, the skies cleared, and the deep roar of Allied bombers filled the air. Columns of German tanks and supply trucks became visible targets. Fighter bombers of the U.S. 9th Air Force struck relentlessly, shredding convoys that had once moved unseen through the forest. What had looked like a victorious advance now began to slow. Fuel shortages worsened. Roads clogged with wreckage. German commanders realized they had driven too far, too fast. Their offensive Bulge was stretched thin, a massive salient vulnerable on both flanks. As Patton's armored columns raced north, Eisenhower saw a chance not just to rescue Bastogne, but to destroy a large portion of the German army trapped in the salient. What had begun as a defensive response was turning into a deliberate encirclement. By Christmas Eve, American radio intercepts confirmed it: the Germans were in trouble. Their panzers were running out of fuel, and Allied reinforcements were closing from every direction. The trap that had been forming since the first day of the offensive was nearly complete. Bastogne still held. The snow-covered forest that had once seemed the scene of American collapse was now becoming the stage for one of the greatest reversals of the Second World War, where a feigned retreat and brutal endurance turned defeat into a weapon. 1. The human angle, courage in the cold. For the men on the ground, the Ardennes was not just a battlefield, it was a frozen nightmare. The snow was waist-deep in places, and the temperature dropped below -20 degrees at night. Many soldiers fought without proper winter clothing. Their rifles jammed with ice, food froze in their tins. Private letters recovered later revealed the exhaustion and disbelief of those first few days. One American infantryman wrote, "We thought the war was nearly over. Then the woods came alive with tanks." The German attack was ferocious and sudden. Entire U.S. platoons were cut off in the fog, surrounded before they knew what was happening. Yet amid the confusion, acts of courage became routine. Medics crawled through open fire to drag the wounded to shelter. Artillery crews refused to abandon their guns, firing until they were overrun or killed. In Bastogne, paratroopers of the 101st Airborne endured days without resupply. They scavenged food from abandoned farms, melted snow for water, and wrapped themselves in curtains and blankets to keep from freezing. Civilians huddled with them in cellars, sharing the same fear of the next artillery shell. The line between soldier and civilian blurred, everyone inside the encirclement became part of the defense. For German soldiers, the experience was equally punishing. Many had been promised a quick, decisive victory, a strike that would end the war by Christmas. Instead, they marched through ice and snow with little food, pulling fuel drums by hand when their vehicles ran dry. Reports from the 2nd Panzer Division described frostbite, exhaustion, and growing doubt. The deeper they advanced, the more they realized the Americans were not breaking, they were stiffening. That human resilience, quiet and unspectacular, became the hidden engine of the Allied response. The Germans could shatter lines and towns, but they could not extinguish the will to stand, even when everything seemed lost. And it was that human will, multiplied across thousands of soldiers, that gave shape to what the German generals would soon recognize as a trap. 2. The tactical angle, the trap within the terrain. The Ardennes was never meant to be a battleground. It was thick forest, winding roads, and steep ridges, terrain that punished tanks and favored ambush. Both sides had underestimated how the land itself would decide the outcome. At the start, this terrain had seemed perfect for the Germans. Allied commanders believed the area was quiet, defended mostly by tired or inexperienced divisions. The Germans exploited that complacency brilliantly, launching their assault through the woods where no one expected a large-scale offensive. But as the offensive deepened, what had been an advantage turned into a burden. Narrow roads forced German armor into single columns, easy targets for artillery and air attacks once the weather cleared. Destroyed vehicles blocked entire routes. When the Americans began blowing bridges and mining crossroads, the German advance slowed to a crawl. The U.S. engineers, often overlooked in battlefield stories, played a decisive role. They used the terrain not as an obstacle, but as a weapon. In retreating, they destroyed critical junctions, forcing the enemy to funnel through predictable paths. Every hour gained allowed more reinforcements to arrive. Meanwhile, American artillery, particularly the 155 mm howitzers and 105 mm field guns, created overlapping kill zones. Even in retreat, batteries stayed just long enough to rain shells on advancing panzers before pulling back again. This rhythm of hit, delay, reposition confused the German command. They couldn't tell if the Americans were retreating, regrouping, or setting up something more. By the time the Germans realized they were being drawn deeper into a narrowing front, the damage was done. Their supply lines were overstretched, their fuel depots captured, and their armor trapped in valleys where maneuver was impossible. The Ardennes, once chosen by the Germans for its concealment, had become the Americans' greatest ally, a natural fortress that turned the illusion of defeat into a calculated defense. As the snow kept falling and engines froze in the cold, German generals began to understand, the Americans weren't running. They were waiting. 3. The leadership angle, calm minds in chaos. In moments when empires tremble, leadership becomes everything. The Ardennes offensive was one of those moments. For the Allies, victory came not just from courage in the trenches, but from the decisions made in a handful of war rooms under immense pressure. At the top sat General Dwight D. Eisenhower, whose strength was steadiness. While others panicked over the German breakthrough, he remained composed. He understood that wars aren't lost in a single surprise, they're lost when panic spreads faster than strategy. Eisenhower's order was simple and firm: hold the line. Then, counterattack. Below him, General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, faced the immediate collapse of his northern flank. He absorbed the shock, regrouped his scattered corps, and kept communication lines open despite the confusion. His ability to delegate, trusting field commanders like Middleton and Ridgway, allowed the front to bend but not break. Then came General George S. Patton, the most aggressive of them all. While other officers studied maps, Patton had already rehearsed a pivot of his entire army days before Eisenhower even requested it. His readiness turned theory into movement. When given the order to relieve Bastogne, Patton simply replied, "We'll be there in 48 hours. It seemed impossible, yet he delivered. Patton's logistical staff performed miracles. In freezing conditions, tens of thousands of vehicles were redirected north, moving along narrow roads under blackout conditions. Fuel shortages, traffic jams, and snowstorms were constant obstacles. But the Third Army advanced like a machine. Soldiers who had been fighting east toward Germany now turned west to face it again. The contrast in leadership between the two sides could not have been sharper. While the Americans coordinated and adapted, the German chain of command was paralyzed by Hitler's interference. He refused to allow tactical withdrawals or adjustments, insisting that every unit fight to the last. What began as a daring strike devolved into a slow, grinding retreat, commanded not by field experience, but by obsession from Berlin. In the end, leadership, calm, flexible, and united, proved deadlier than tanks or guns. 4. The intelligence angle, the blindness of certainty. Wars are often decided not only by what armies see, but by what they fail to see. The Battle of the Bulge was one of the clearest examples of that truth. The Germans achieved total surprise at the start. Allied intelligence, usually sharp, missed nearly every warning. Aerial reconnaissance was limited by bad weather. Radio intercepts went unnoticed amid heavy traffic. Even local civilians who reported troop movements were dismissed. American analysts believed the Germans were too weak to launch a major attack. But while the Allies suffered from overconfidence, the Germans suffered from blindness of their own. They assumed the American army, composed of citizen soldiers, not long-trained professionals, would crumble once shocked. That miscalculation became fatal. As the offensive stretched on, Allied intelligence began to recover. Codebreakers and reconnaissance units tracked the shifting front lines and fuel shortages within German divisions. Radio decrypts revealed that key panzer units were already running on fumes. The more the Germans pushed forward, the more their messages betrayed desperation. Meanwhile, American signal units improvised new communication networks to replace those destroyed in the first onslaught. This restored command control far faster than the Germans expected. Within days, what had been a battlefield fog began to lift. Patton's staff used intercepted coordinates to plan artillery ambushes on advancing convoys. By the time Allied aircraft returned to the skies, intelligence officers had a clear picture of German positions. Precision airstrikes followed, hitting supply lines and bridges that crippled movement. The Germans had begun the battle as hunters, but now they were the ones being tracked. Certainty, not ignorance, doomed them. Their faith in a quick victory blinded them to the trap closing around them, a trap built not on deception, but on their own misjudgment. 5. The moral angle, turning defeat into strategy. The Battle of the Bulge was more than a clash of armies. It was a study in how nations confront crisis, how one army saw failure as final, while another saw it as fuel. For the German command, setbacks were intolerable. Every retreat was a disgrace, every pause a betrayal of the Führer's will. This rigid mindset forced units to keep advancing even when it made no tactical sense. Soldiers died not for ground, but for pride. For the Americans, defeat was not an ending but a signal, a reason to adapt. They absorbed punishment, learned from it, and struck back. The idea of fighting withdrawals, of giving ground to gain time, turned what looked like a rout into an organized resistance. That mental flexibility, born of a democratic army of ordinary men, became a moral strength. They were not fighting for conquest or ideology, but for survival and each other. When the order came to hold Bastogne, they did so not because they believed they would win, but because giving up wasn't an option. This difference in mindset defined the outcome. The Germans sought perfection and broke when they fell short. The Americans accepted chaos and turned it into order. In the snows of the Ardennes, defeat became the raw material of victory, and history would remember it as one of the finest hours of American resolve. The turning point came not with a roar, but with a silence, the kind that follows exhaustion and realization. By December 22, 1944, the German offensive had reached its farthest advance. Their spearheads were only a few miles from the Meuse River, but progress had slowed to a crawl. Tanks ran out of fuel in the snow, crews siphoned petrol from abandoned vehicles, and supply trucks lay wrecked along narrow forest roads. In Bastogne, the siege was tightening. The 101st Airborne Division and elements of the 10th Armored Division were completely surrounded. Ammunition was running dangerously low. Men rationed each bullet, each shell. The wounded were kept in freezing basements, their bandages stiff with frost. There was no morphine left. Yet morale held. Every failed German assault only deepened the defenders' resolve. Then came the German ultimatum, a formal message delivered under a white flag. It demanded the honorable surrender of Bastogne to avoid total annihilation. The paper was handed to Brigadier General McAuliffe, who read it, looked up, and laughed. His reply was one word: nuts. That single, almost absurd response rippled across the American lines like a spark. It wasn't bravado, it was clarity. The men in Bastogne were done surrendering ground. If they were going to die, it would be where they stood. Outside the encirclement, Patton's Third Army was on the move. Against all odds, the massive pivot he'd promised Eisenhower was underway. In less than 3 days, 133,000 vehicles, 60,000 tons of supplies, and 250,000 men began rolling north through ice and fog. The movement defied military logic, a logistical masterpiece few believed possible. On December 23, the skies cleared. Allied pilots who had been grounded for days finally took off. The sound of engines overhead filled Bastogne with renewed hope. 47 transports dropped supplies by parachute, food, ammunition, medical kits. Some fell into German lines, but enough reached the Americans to keep them fighting. Above, Thunderbolt fighters and Marauder bombers roared through the blue sky, hunting columns of German armor trapped on narrow roads. Air power, dormant for nearly a week, now turned the battlefield into a furnace. Fuel depots exploded. Bridges collapsed. Convoys that had once symbolized German momentum were reduced to smoldering wreckage. Inside the German ranks, confusion spread. Orders from Berlin still demanded attack, but units were fighting blind. Radios crackled with broken messages. Some commanders, realizing the hopelessness, began to pull back without authorization. Others pressed forward, unaware their flanks were collapsing. At Bastogne, the Americans held every street. German infantry, supported by tanks, launched repeated assaults through the snow. Each time, paratroopers met them with rifles, bazookas, and point-blank artillery fire. Civilians hid in cellars as buildings collapsed above them. By Christmas Eve, the town was little more than rubble, but the defense stood unbroken. That night, as shells thundered in the distance, McAuliffe walked among his men. Chaplains prayed over the wounded. Soldiers huddled near fires made from broken furniture. One wrote in his diary, "We're still here. The bastards haven't moved us yet." To the Germans, it was unthinkable. According to every calculation, Bastogne should have fallen days earlier. Instead, it became a fortress, one that absorbed and neutralized their strength. Every tank committed, there was a tank lost to the wider offensive. Then, in the early hours of December 26th, the sound of engines echoed from the south. At first, the defenders thought it was another German column. But soon, the unmistakable gleam of white stars appeared through the fog. Patton's spearhead, the 37th Tank Battalion, led by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, had broken through the encirclement. When the first Sherman tanks rolled into Bastogne, exhausted paratroopers greeted them with disbelief and laughter. The relief had come just in time. The siege was over. For the German command, the realization was devastating. Their greatest gamble in the West had failed. What had begun as an ambitious strike to divide the Allies had instead trapped their own divisions in the snowbound forests of Belgium. The defeat hadn't yet fully unfolded, but the momentum was gone. The trap the Americans had set through patience, discipline, and endurance was now snapping shut. When Patton's tanks broke through to Bastogne, the battle was far from over. The Germans still held strong positions around the town, and winter was their ally. Snowfall returned with renewed fury, covering the wreckage of vehicles and men alike. But now, the momentum had shifted, decisively. Patton didn't pause. His forces immediately pushed to widen the corridor and link Bastogne fully with the southern front. American columns poured through the gap, bringing with them fuel, ammunition, and medical teams. The defenders, gaunt and frostbitten, finally received hot meals for the first time in a week. At the same time, Eisenhower's broader strategy came into focus. The initial German success had created a deep salient, a bulge that extended west but was exposed on both sides. The Americans would strike at those flanks simultaneously, trapping the enemy inside their own offensive. What began as a desperate defense was now turning into a calculated encirclement. By December 28th, the weather had cleared completely. The skies filled with Allied aircraft, fighters, bombers, reconnaissance planes, sweeping unchallenged. The Luftwaffe, once feared across Europe, barely made an appearance. Every road, every bridge, every fuel depot within the German lines became a target. Convoys burned. Panzer divisions found themselves stranded without fuel or cover. German soldiers abandoned their tanks, marching on foot through the snow. Wounded men froze where they fell. Commanders sent frantic messages to Berlin asking for permission to retreat. Hitler refused. He still believed a counterattack could turn the tide. His generals knew otherwise. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, once one of Hitler's most trusted strategists, admitted privately that the offensive was lost. General Otto von Manschufel reported that his panzers were fighting with their last drops of fuel. In some units, tanks were destroyed not by enemy fire but by their own crews, detonated to prevent capture after running dry. Meanwhile, on the American side, coordination between ground and air forces reached near perfection. Spotter planes marked German armor with smoke flares, guiding artillery and fighter bombers to precise strikes. The dense Ardennes Forest, which had hidden the attackers in the beginning, now became a death trap, every column of movement visible from above against the white snow. At the northern edge of the salient, British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery organized a massive counteroffensive with the 21st Army Group, tightening the noose from that direction. From the south, Patton's Third Army kept pressing. The two forces were closing in like pincers. The Germans fought stubbornly, often to the last man. Towns like Houffalize and La Roche turned into infernos. Small American patrols found entire platoons of frozen enemy soldiers still in formation, rifles in hand. The offensive that had once been hailed as Hitler's winter thunderbolt was now a graveyard of armor and ambition. By the first week of January 1945, the German advance was completely halted. What remained of their divisions began retreating east under relentless air assault. Eisenhower ordered the Allies to squeeze the Bulge back to its original line, and within days, the front was restored. The numbers told the story. Germany had lost nearly 100,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured. Over 600 tanks and assault guns were destroyed. The Allies suffered heavy losses too, around 75,000 casualties, but they could replace them. Germany could not. The Ardennes had consumed the last reserves of the Wehrmacht. Elite divisions that could have defended the Rhine were gone. The offensive had not only failed, it had hastened Germany's defeat. In the aftermath of the breakout, Allied officers touring the battlefield were stunned by the scale of destruction. Roads were lined with burnt-out vehicles, shattered helmets, and frozen bodies locked in combat poses. The forest smelled of diesel and death. In the command bunkers, captured German officers spoke with disbelief. Many admitted they had thought the Americans were on the verge of collapse. The defeat they believed they were pursuing had, in reality, been a slow, deliberate draw into the jaws of an overwhelming response. It was not luck. It was calculation, endurance, and adaptation, the hallmarks of a modern army that refused to panic. The Americans had absorbed the hardest blow the Wehrmacht could deliver, and then turned it into a weapon. The trap had closed completely. The Bulge was gone. The road to the Rhine now lay open. When the guns finally fell silent in the Ardennes, the forests of Belgium and Luxembourg were left in ruins. Whole villages had vanished beneath snow and shellfire. Burned-out tanks littered the roads, their steel husks half buried in drifts. The air still carried the bitter stench of fuel, smoke, and cordite. For the survivors, both American and German, the silence felt unreal. In the days that followed, Allied patrols swept through what had once been the front line. They found foxholes filled with frozen bodies, horses dead in their harnesses, and abandoned equipment stretching for miles. Locals emerged cautiously from cellars and barns, stunned by the scale of destruction. What they had witnessed was not just another battle, it was the dying convulsion of Hitler's war machine. The Battle of the Bulge, or Ardennes Offensive, as the Germans called it, had lasted 6 brutal weeks, from December 16, 1944, to January 25, 1945. It was the largest and bloodiest single battle fought by the United States in World War II. More than 600,000 American troops took part, facing nearly 500,000 German soldiers in one of the harshest winters on record. Though the cost was immense, the strategic outcome was decisive. The German army had gambled everything on one final offensive, and lost. Their last armored reserves were destroyed, their fuel depots emptied, and their ability to launch another major attack was gone forever. From that point onward, Germany was on the defensive, retreating toward its borders under the relentless pressure of the advancing Allies. For Hitler, the failure of the Ardennes offensive was a personal humiliation. He had ignored the cautious advice of his generals, believing that one bold strike could shatter Allied morale and force a negotiated peace. Instead, his decision condemned the Wehrmacht to exhaustion and collapse. Even his most loyal commanders, men like Manschufel and Sepp Dietrich, later admitted the plan was doomed from the start. In Allied headquarters, the mood was a mixture of relief and grim satisfaction. Eisenhower called the victory proof that the spirit of the American soldier cannot be broken. General Omar Bradley, whose 1st and 3rd armies bore the brunt of the fighting, said simply, "The Germans shot their last bolt and missed." For the men on the ground, however, there was little sense of triumph. The price had been staggering. Entire divisions were nearly wiped out. In towns like Bastogne, Saint-Vith, and Foy, American soldiers continued to recover their dead long after the fighting had ended. Many veterans later described the Ardennes not as a victory, but as survival. They remembered the freezing nights in foxholes, the constant shelling, and the sight of fallen comrades who never woke from the cold. War correspondents who toured the area compared it to a moonscape, lifeless, white, and broken. Yet amid the devastation, one truth stood out clearly. The German army would never again mount an offensive of that scale. The Bulge had drained their last strength. When the Allies crossed the Rhine 2 months later, there was no second surprise. The road to Berlin was open, and the end of the war was only months away. Still, the Battle of the Bulge left a lasting mark on military history. It demonstrated the danger of underestimating a desperate enemy, and the importance of resilience under pressure. The Americans had faced their greatest crisis of the European campaign and emerged stronger for it. For the German side, it was the moment their illusion of invincibility finally shattered. No longer could Hitler's generals pretend that the war was winnable. The Ardennes had shown that courage and cunning were no longer enough against the overwhelming industrial and logistical power of the Allies. By February 1945, as the snow began to melt, the roads through the Ardennes were cleared once more. Convoys rolled eastward, this time not in retreat, but in pursuit. Behind them, the forest slowly reclaimed the scars of battle. But for those who fought there, the memories would never fade. The Battle of the Bulge had ended. The war was entering its final act. In the months after the Ardennes campaign, the scale of its human cost came into sharper focus. Official reports listed more than 19,000 Americans killed, 47,000 wounded, and 23,000 captured or missing. For the Germans, estimates ranged from 80,000 to 100,000 total casualties, including thousands who froze to death or were lost in chaotic retreats through the snow. These were not just numbers on paper, they were fathers, sons, and brothers, lost in a final futile gamble. The towns and villages that had endured the battle became symbols of both suffering and resilience. Bastogne, which had stood as the fortress of American defiance, was reduced to rubble. Its citizens had spent weeks huddled in basements, surviving on melted snow and scraps of food. When General George S. Patton's Third Army finally broke through to relieve the siege on December 26, many wept openly in the streets. In the years that followed, Bastogne rebuilt, but it never forgot. Even today, the town remains a living monument to the courage of those who fought there. Memorials dot the hills and crossroads where paratroopers and tank crews once held their ground against overwhelming odds. For the U.S. Army, the battle became a defining test of endurance and leadership. It revealed both the vulnerabilities of the Allied command and the extraordinary adaptability of its soldiers. Units that had been shattered regrouped and fought back. Young officers, often with no clear orders, made split-second decisions that turned chaos into opportunity. The Bulge became a crucible that hardened the American military for the final push into Germany. For the German High Command, the aftermath was darker. The loss of men, tanks, and fuel crippled their ability to defend the Western Front. Hitler's last gamble had consumed the reserves that might have slowed the Allied advance in 1945. The once mighty panzer divisions were now little more than scattered remnants. Their commanders returned home not as heroes, but as survivors of a catastrophe. The psychological damage was equally severe. The myth of German invincibility, carefully cultivated since 1939, had been broken. Soldiers who had once marched with unshakable faith now fought only to delay the inevitable. Letters from the front told of despair and exhaustion. "We are fighting ghosts," one Wehrmacht officer wrote in January 1945. "The Americans fall back, and we think they are beaten, then they rise again with more tanks, more planes, more fire." For the Allies, the Battle of the Bulge also carried lessons in humility. The initial German success exposed weaknesses in Allied intelligence, logistics, and complacency. Eisenhower later admitted that the offensive caught us unprepared, and we paid for it. But it also proved the strength of Allied cooperation. British, Canadian, and American forces coordinated their response, closing the gaps and turning a potential disaster into a decisive victory. The world took notice. Newsreels from the front showed the grim faces of U.S. infantrymen marching through the snow, exhausted but unbroken. Headlines back home declared, "Defeat turned into triumph." The battle became a symbol of American resolve, proof that even in the bleakest moment, the nation could rally and strike back. In the long shadow of war, the Ardennes also became a place of reconciliation. Decades later, veterans from both sides would return to those forests, standing together in silence where they had once fought. Some wept. Others simply placed their hands on old stone markers and whispered the names of the fallen. The snow, they said, had covered everything, the wounds, the fear, the hatred, but not the memories. From a military perspective, the Bulge was the last gasp of the German army in the West. From a human one, it was a tragedy shared by both sides. As the Allies crossed the Rhine in March 1945, they carried with them the lessons of that winter. Every soldier who had survived the Ardennes knew what endurance meant. They knew that war could push men to the edge, and still demand more. And as they advanced into the heart of Germany, they did so with the quiet understanding that their next battles would end not just a campaign, but the entire war itself. The trap that began in defeat had now closed in victory. but its cost would echo for generations. The Battle of the Bulge stands today as one of the most revealing moments of the Second World War, not only for what happened on the battlefield, but for what it exposed about the nature of war itself. It was a test of endurance, faith, and adaptability. It showed how quickly the line between defeat and victory could blur, and how leadership and morale could tip the balance when resources and luck seemed spent. For Germany, it was the moment when hope finally gave way to reality. The Ardennes offensive was born from desperation, a belief that one last strike could reverse the inevitable. But in the frozen woods of Belgium, that illusion shattered. What had begun as an attempt to divide the Allies only united them further. It was the last act of a regime fighting against time, reason, and the weight of its own ruin. For the Americans, the battle became a symbol of resilience. Units that had been ambushed and scattered rebuilt themselves under fire. Commanders improvised, soldiers endured, and small acts of courage accumulated into something far greater, the quiet strength of an army that refused to break. In that sense, the Bulge was not just a military turning point, but a human one. Historians often describe it as the last great battle of the West, and in many ways, it was. After the Ardennes, the war's end was not in question, only how much suffering would remain before peace returned. The forest that once echoed with artillery and screams grew silent again, its snow covering the scars of battle. But for those who fought there, the echoes never truly faded. The Bulge reminds us that even in war's darkest hour, resolve can outlast despair. Defeat can become strategy. And from the depths of chaos, nations can find their defining strength. In the winter of 1944, amid the cold, the hunger, and the fear, the world saw the measure of endurance, not in victory alone, but in the will to rise again when all seemed lost. That will would carry the Allies to victory. And it would mark the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany.